So again, my presentation is not going to be as long. It's going to be a little bit more specialized. Let me get to Keynote. Let's hope this little thingy works. There we go. Okay, so my presentation is going to be a little different. Georgia did a great job of sort of not only yellow fever in Memphis, but yellow fever was the same everywhere. Every single town, every single city, same disease. That is not what they thought back then. If you read the reports back then, of course, like Georgia said, they didn't know what caused yellow fever. And if you don't know what causes a virus or causes a disease, there's no way to fight it. You can throw things at it like medicines and whiskey, cold whiskey, which sounds good, but it's just not going to do much good. So you have to know what causes a disease or virus to combat it. Another thing that everyone thought back then, you see it in every newspaper at the time, is they thought yellow fever was localized. They thought that it wasn't just a broad virus that was going around. They thought that each town had its own version of yellow fever, which is why you get newspaper reports of Grenada fever. We have a Grenada fever here, but we also have a Memphis fever here, and it's okay that they're put together in the same room because they can't get us sick, because we in Holly Springs can't get Grenada fever. We can't get Memphis fever. We can only get Holly Springs fever, which doesn't exist because Holly Springs is immune to yellow fever. You're going to see some ridiculous things about the show, but it really was what they believed. We were immune to yellow fever. I'm not going to go into the details of yellow fever, but one thing I do want to point out that's very, very, very important when we're talking about yellow fever is remember something. And a lot of people get this wrong even today. To get yellow fever, you have to have two things. You do need the mosquito, but the mosquito is only the vector. The mosquito is what transmits yellow fever. Yellow fever does not come from mosquitoes. It doesn't originate from them. Yellow fever, when we're talking about the virus, which is on this left side, the virus originates from primates. We think in Africa, probably actual primates, and then switch to humans. But only a human being or a primate of sorts can actually create or hold yellow fever. The mosquito can transmit it, but you have to have both, which is why when people ask me, how did so many towns quarantine and save themselves from yellow fever? Because there's mosquitoes everywhere. How do you quarantine a mosquito? Well, you're not quarantining the mosquito. You're quarantining the person who's bringing that fever. And if you do a good enough job, and you keep at least most of these human beings who are transmitting fever, if you keep them out of your town, you're gonna protect yourselves. We do have examples of towns, including Jackson, Mississippi, that had a really strong quarantine, and they did have deaths. There's no way to prevent any deaths, but they didn't have hundreds or thousands of deaths. And so it's important to remember as we're talking about this. So I'm going to be talking about Holly Springs. We're here in Holly Springs. How did we get yellow fever? And I do want to say that my thoughts of this have changed after talking to other experts and doing my own research. First of all, I don't think it's going to be possible for us in the year 2022 to find out how yellow fever originates in any of these towns. We talked about Kate Beyond, and we'll be talking about her a little bit later. We talk about the original yellow fever victims here. But more than likely, that's just not how it worked, especially here in Holly Springs. What we have is what I like to call now bodies of virus, which means any one person who comes to this town that has virus in them is a potential source for that virus that can be transmitted by the mosquito. So you're not going to be able to find patient 0 because more than likely patient 0 came with patient 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 as well. And I just don't think that's possible. Now, we can try to narrow it down a little bit. And in Holly Springs, we have, and I say we, really me, have 3 theories of where yellow fever came from. This is the first. This is the one that for about a year or two I championed like anything. But I am a historian at heart, and so when I'm presented with evidence that shows that my theory is not correct, you let go and you realize it's not possible. But I was not the only one who thought this, as we're about to see. This is a picture of what we call the Pointer House. It no longer stands here in Holly Springs. It was out by the railroad that way. This is where the federal garrison in Holly Springs was. Now, we're talking about 2 federal garrisons. We're really talking about after the end of the Civil War, We have Holly Springs and many other towns in the South were occupied by federal soldiers. The federal government just wasn't sure, rightly, that we were going to treat the newly freed slaves and other individuals right, or they weren't really satisfied that we weren't going to rebel again. So we had garrisons. Holly Springs had one of the garrisons for many years after the end of the Civil War. That garrison eventually left, so that's not what we're talking about, but the buildings were left behind. This garrison is the garrison that was in New Orleans. And what happens, all these are going to be primary sources. All historians here know, always use your primary sources. Don't rely on secondary sources. Use your primary sources. Primary sources back then for yellow fever are going to be primarily newspaper reports. These are people who are experiencing it, writing it. It doesn't mean that they can't get it wrong, as we'll see, and it doesn't mean that they're not biased. They're very biased. But this is as close as we get to someone who's there. This is the Memphis Daily Appeal, August 2nd, so very early. This is where we get the start of this theory. Where does yellow fever come from? Of course, by August 2nd, yellow fever is just devastating New Orleans. We have the federal garrison down there, and what is the federal government going to do? They're going to move them. They don't want to risk these soldiers' lives, so we're going to get them out. Where is the next place they're going to go? Well, they're going to go to Holly Springs, because Holly Springs is already set up for a federal garrison. So we're going to send them here. We see here that the troops quartered in New Orleans arrived in Holly Springs. 8 men were left behind. The presence of yellow fever caused the soldiers to move. So here's the theory. The theory that a lot of people jumped on back then was that these soldiers, some of them might have had yellow fever. And I think that's very possible. Can I prove it? Not really. But I think it's very possible. So they're now in Holly Springs, early August 1878. And here's where we get really interesting. We have this report in the Memphis Public Ledger 11 days later. A report was current yesterday that yellow fever had broken out among the federal troops here in Holly Springs. Now, this is where we get into, this is a primary source, so we rely on it, but we also realize of some bias here because these reports are coming out of Holly Springs. And Holly Springs, particularly the leaders of Holly Springs, have made a decision. They're going to stand their ground on one decision. It was a horrible decision, one of the worst decisions ever made in this town's history. That decision was Holly Springs was immune to yellow fever, and therefore we are going to invite every single person who wants to come in town to come to town. We talk about quarantine, this is like the anti-quarantine. This is what you do when you're really stupid. And this is one of the reasons you don't trust politicians, in my opinion, most politicians. But the politicians, the board, the mayor, and all that have determined, have ordered the town disinfected, or they're opposed to quarantine. They express a sentiment that the gates of the city of flowers be open to refugees from all of our suffering sister cities. The doctors here do not believe that there is any danger of fever coming here. The town is clean and healthy. Really ridiculous. Even if you don't know where this virus is coming from, you do the sensible thing and you quarantine your town. Holly Springs did not do that. We can go into why. There's some theories that people thought because we were so high up in the hills, yellow fever couldn't get to us. I don't know if anyone believed that or not, but that's it. This is very similar. I love this. This is a telegraph that's sent from the town, the noble-hearted little city, to New Orleans. Remember, New Orleans is getting hit really hard. We don't want those people here in this town. I'm sorry to New Orleans citizens, but we don't want them in Holly Springs in mid-August of 1878, but the town leaders decided we did. So this is a telegram basically an ad, just like Holly Springs Main Street puts ads in other towns today. Come to our city. We have great hotels and food and all that. This is the exact same thing. We apprehend nothing like even a brush with yellow jack, not much less an epidemic. Last words there, I guess. But so here's the problem with that theory. The theory is that someone in that federal garrison brought yellow fever, and then it spread from the garrison to the town. The problem with that is there simply is no reliable supporting evidence. The one evidence I found that I just jumped on was this one little bit in the Bossier Banner. 40 cases and 4 deaths reported at Holly Springs. This would have been August 15th. We certainly have no evidence that there was 40 cases at Holly Springs that early. So what's going on here? If you do a little bit of digging, you realize that the Bossier Banner just took a report from an earlier newspaper that had Grenada listed, mixed up Grenada for Holly Springs, this is not Holly Springs. I think about 4 or 5 of the local historians have gotten together and researched this, and these are Grenada we're talking about. So Grenada is going to be Holly Springs. So that was kind of a blow to me. That was a blow to my theory of where yellow fever came from. Certainly still possible, but there's no evidence to support that. So we're done with that. The second one is the Grenada theory. This is the established theory. This is a story that all of Holly Springs knows. This is the traditional story of how Holly Springs got sick of yellow fever. It's not going to work really great, as we'll see, but this is the yellow fever house just over here. This is where the Grenada version of yellow fever came from. Back to our primary sources, the Memphis Public Ledger of August 17th. This is William Holland. Now, if you're from Holly Springs, you know that name. He is really the hero of yellow fever here in town, and he was a great gentleman. He was a great, he stood when a lot of other people in this town left, including the mayor and the aldermen, the politicians. So he is a great guy, but he is guilty, like everyone else, of believing that Holly Springs was immune. So again, this is him writing to the public ledger. Holly Springs is not quarantined. There's no fever. This is where we get interesting. The hotels and many private residences are already filled with refugees. The capacity for accommodating strangers is exhausted. I give this information for the benefit of those who have not heretofore secured quarters and may desire to come. What he's basically saying is, come on now, you better come on. We're losing space. If you want to come to this town, come on. It's an ad, basically. It's an advertisement to come to town. So he's fallen guilty, just like the politicians, of believing this. And people did come. In fact, we have 2 people from Grenada. Remember, Grenada at this time is really the epicenter of yellow fever in North Mississippi. This is where a lot of the fever is going to come from. Why is Grenada hit so hard? Well, one word is the railroad. The railroad goes right through Grenada. A lot of refugees came that way, and that's how Grenada got hit. Guess what town is also on the railroad? Holly Springs. So not great. So this is, traditionally speaking, we have 2 victims from yellow fever. This is Mr. Downs, a refugee from Grenada. He's the first, according to this source, the first yellow fever victim. Of course, yesterday, this is on the 21st, so yesterday would be the 20th. So August 20th is our very first victim. Again, the town is not concerned. Why? Because he has Grenada fever. Grenada fever cannot be transmitted to Holly Springs, so we thought. No one's concerned. There's not a hint of concern in any of the newspapers, any of the private correspondence we have, and you're going to see one of them in a second. No one's concerned at all. Here we go, August 24th. We have another case at Holly Springs. Delilah Lake, a refugee from Grenada. He's arriving here 8 days ago. That's important. If you do your math, you can kind of figure out when the first Grenada victims arrived. Downs and Martin, who's another individual from Grenada, are not expected to live. So we have 3 victims now. Again, no concern, no panic. And that's basically the end of the Grenada. That's where we believe that these 3, Martin, Downs, and Lake, brought yellow fever to Grenada. They're put in the yellow fever house, which is where William Holland lived. He gave his house to these victims. And the theory is that these victims died and then spread yellow fever to the rest of the town. There's going to be a big problem with that. The problem is, if you know anything about yellow fever is very similar to COVID in that you don't just contract it and the next day die. You have a long transmission period. You have a period between one day, really about 2 weeks, from the day you contract it to get sick, to you're contagious, to you die. So when you start seeing people dying in Holly Springs, which is right about September 1st, you can't assume that they contracted yellow fever in late August. It just doesn't work that way. You've got to go back at least 2 weeks. So that's the number one problem. Here's another problem. Now, this story deserves its own presentation, and maybe next year I'll do it. So we won't go into detail, but this down here are the Buchanan sisters. The Buchanan is another name, if you're from Holly Springs, you're very familiar with. George Buchanan, back in the 1860s, 1870s, was, and we're not going to get into politics too much, but he was a Republican. And all you Republicans out there saying, yeah, you don't need to do that, because the Republicans in 1870 were not quite like they are today. He would have been basically no other way to describe it. He would have been a liberal. He would have been someone who didn't support succession. He would have been someone who supported what we call Reconstruction. He was very friendly with the local African American population, to the point that the local newspapers were just outraged by this. The Buchanans got the last laugh because about 2 or 3 generations later, one of his ancestors, or one of his descendants, was the mayor of Holly Springs, one of the more well-known. The Buchanan family is still around today. I'm good friends with many of them, so they're still around. They still stayed. But what we're getting at is George Buchanan, who we just talked about, had 3 daughters. And very early in the fever, we're talking in the 18th, 19th, 20th, he left Holly Springs. He saw what everyone else, no one else was concerned, George Buchanan was. And he got the heck out of there. He went to a town called Blunt Springs, North Alabama, which was a resort town with what we call, I guess, a resort town, basically. Healing Springs, exactly, Springs and all that. Left, went there, brought his 3 young girls there. What happens almost immediately when he arrives there? All 3 of his girls start dying, one after another. The first one dies August 21st. So if you're doing the math in your head, you realize what the problem is. If we think that these Grenada victims arrived in town the 18th, 19th, and 20th, there's simply no way that the Buchanan children contracted yellow fever from the Grenada victims. There's no way. Now, there is a lot of controversy whether they died of yellow fever. Why? Because when they died of yellow fever symptoms in North Alabama, the local population refused to accept that they had died of yellow fever. In fact, they were so concerned that this was going to dry up their business that there was this massive inquest. The Buchanan family was just dragged through the press, basically saying that they had lied, that their daughters, and this is the truth. This is the truth as they saw it. I read an article that literally said that the Buchanan girls caused their own death because they got into our pool here. You know, at the resort, there's a cold pool and then there's a hot pool, and you're not supposed to jump in from the cold to the hot because it can cause problems. Not really. That's just 18th, 19th century voodoo. But they said that the girls all 3 of them jumped into the cold water to the hot water too quickly, and they all just died with black vomit and blood and all that. It was ridiculous reading it now, but that's what they believed. So they are not considered, to this day, the Buchanan girls are not considered yellow fever victims. They're not listed in any of the yellow fever because at the time, the people in Alabama just refused to accept it. They are not listed as victims. I'll let you make your own assumptions, and I guess we'll have our own presentation one day, but they're yellow fever victims, there's no doubt. And there's no doubt that they contracted it here in Holly Springs. There's no doubt that they got that from somewhere besides the Grenada victims. So who else did they get it from in early August? Well, this is why I invited my Memphis friends here, not just because we're good friends, but I think my theory now is, again, knowing that we can't narrow down where yellow fever came from, Memphis. A lot of evidence is giving that the people coming from the south up north, but we also have victims in Memphis coming down to Holly Springs. Because even though Holly Springs wasn't a resort town, Holly Springs has that big ad in the newspaper saying, "Come to our town. We're up in the hills. You can't get sick here. We have hotels." Exactly, you're safe here. Look, you don't want to be in Memphis. Look, this is the ad that they put in the newspaper. The giant skull eating Memphis, the poor riverboat trying to escape. Come to us. Don't stay in Memphis. And it worked. From Memphis to Holly Springs, possible source of transmission. Here's another article, our picture that was in the newspapers. Get back, mister. We don't want yellow fever in our town. These are people leaving Memphis and saying, no, get away from us. This wasn't Holly Springs, though. And so what we're going to do now, and this is sort of jumping on to the Memphis, stepping on their toes, but to understand how we go from Memphis to Holly Springs, we need to talk about Cape Beyonda. Now, Cape Beyonda is, you heard from George's presentation, is considered Memphis's patient zero. Not really, because we know now that there were victims before her, but she is considered patient zero. And even before we came up with this, I was going to do a video on Cape Beyonda. So it just sort of worked together. This is about a 12-minute video. This is So we're going to watch this real quick, and it's getting dark now, so it should turn out pretty well. As a historian, that's not right. I like the human story, and towards the end, we talk about the effects of yellow fever all the time. We don't always think about the people left behind, the family members, and you see with the Beyond family just how devastating it is to lose an important part of your family, your mother and then your father. Willie Beyond, he just disappears. I'm sure someone could do a little bit more digging, but I wasn't able to find him after he was in trouble at 15, just a few years later, and he's not buried in the family plot or anything like that. So who knows what happened there? And to me, that's tragic, because if it wasn't for the yellow fever, maybe he would still have at least a mother, and maybe something else would have happened. But that's always, to me, sort of very tragic. So just real quick, how do we get from Cape Beyonda to the Memphis theory? Well, it's this gentleman right here, Harry Levy. If you're from Holly Springs, that Levy name is probably familiar. Harry Levy was a member of the Levy family, a very well-known, very influential Jewish family. Half of them lived in Memphis, the other half lived in Holly Springs. Holly Springs' most famous Levy was I.C. Levy, a merchant who had a store on the square for many, many decades. The Levy store actually existed in various forms all the way up until about 10, 20 years ago. The store today is now called Retro Rooster. You can visit it. It's not owned by the Levy family anymore, but it is. You can still visit, you can still shop there. So who is Harry Levy? Well, this article from August 23rd mentions our Grenada victims. It says S.L. Downs, J.R. Martin, they've yielded to treatment, blah, blah, blah. At the very end is where it gets interesting. Harry Levy, arriving here from Memphis today, has yellow fever. Before I found this article, his name never appears in the local historical record at all. He's not ever mentioned as ever being here, which is very strange considering who his uncle was. This is the nephew of I.C. Levy, fleeing Memphis, coming to Holly Springs. But it gets even weirder than that, if you ask me. This is a really, really important document. This is a typescript of it. The descendant of William Clark. William Clark was a resident here in Holly Springs. He, very well known, very early, well not early, about mid, he was one of the many that fled the town, just like the Buchanan families. He didn't go to Blunt Springs, he went to Tuscumbia, Alabama, further north. And that's where he went with his family. But before he did that, he wrote this letter to a daughter that lived outside of town. This is such an important artifact because it gives us an eyewitness, no bluster, nothing. It's just what one person is experiencing right at the beginning of yellow fever. And this does not at all sound like the official story of these Grenada victims coming in, and then all of a sudden people start dying. What this is telling us is that August 23rd and the week before that, I'll just read parts of this to you, but he's telling about what's going on in town. He's talking about the kitten that comes and sits by me every day to eat. It looks just like you. I call her pet names. And then it's talking about all the people in town. Then it talks about your brother is now working. He was like 14. He's working at his first job. It's just a really common letter. And then he just sort of passively mentions the yellow fever, like, your Aunt Otter came into town today from town. She said she engaged one boarder. I asked who. She said Glover Leggett. She met Mrs. Daniel, who is worn out, at the way people talk about yellow fever. She thinks there's no sense in being so alarmed. I think so too. The sick ones are all doing well under Dr. McKee's treatment. He gets all the yellow fever cases. He's making a great reputation for himself. When I read this, I was just astounded because we now have a week before, or about several days before these Grenada victims, we have someone saying that there's so many cases in town that one doctor is getting all of them. He's known as the yellow fever doctor. To me, that means there's not just one or two cases. There's a lot of yellow fever cases, enough where he's getting a reputation to being the yellow fever doctor. So that completely changes things for me, that this idea that the town was perfectly fine until the last week of August is just blown wide because, but Harry also mentions at the very end, Mr. Levy has gone with his family to J.W. Wells, where Captain Frank lives. He's given up his own house to his nephew, who came from Memphis, with fever on him when he had gotten to the junction. I love this part. Mrs. Levy knew nothing of it until they sent for the doctor, meaning I.C. Levy's wife. Like, just suddenly her nephew appears and he's sick with fever. She's freaking out. She has to leave her house and move into someone else's house. But everyone else in town sort of just doesn't care. It's not that big of a deal. So here we have a mention of Mr. Levy again. This is where it gets interesting. When I found this is where everything exploded for me. This is from the New York Herald. Plucky Holly Springs has had 3 deaths from the fever, but each case was imported from either Grenada or Memphis. The first case there was a Hebrew gentleman named Levi from Memphis. He died last night. Then after him followed his sister, who had nursed him. The third was Mr. Downs, then Mr. Wilshire, then Mr. Martin, then the 2 Blakes. So this is strange. We have Mr. Harry Levy now dying of fever in Holly Springs, and the official first victim. Again, he never appears in any mortuary lists in any town at all. So what is going on here? We know he had fever because we have 3 separate sources telling us he had fever, but did he die? What is the problem with this theory? Well, there's a huge problem. This is, as a historian, Beth, I know you this, you go after a theory, you're in it, and then you find something that just like, well, crap. Well, this was my oh crap. Harry Levy died April 14th, 1930. What is going on here? Because, again, what is going on here? This, from my understanding, is the grave of Harry Levy. His tombstone very clearly states he died in 1930. I've done some research. I've done some genealogical research. I can't really find much about him, and I'm not really sure that this is the same Harry Levy. It seems unlikely it would be 2 of them, because he would be, in 1878, if you know his birthday, he would have been in his like mid-20s, so he would have been old enough to travel to Holly Springs. So what is going on here? Is it another mistake? And that would be my first guess. Yes, the newspaper made a mistake. But here's the problem with that, and I want to be very careful with assuming that the New York Herald got a mistake. Unlike all the other newspapers all around the country who was reporting about yellow fever, the New York Herald, which would have been the predecessor to the New York Times today, did something really special. They didn't just get information from other correspondents. The New York Herald sent their own yellow fever correspondent. Can you imagine getting that job? You're new in the New York Herald. Guess what? We're sending you down to the South to cover yellow fever. No, thank you. But they did. They sent their own person down, who not only went down, he went down to Grenada, to ground zero for yellow fever in mid-August. And when things got too bad, where did this correspondent go? To Holly Springs. So he is in Holly Springs when all this is happening. He's the one writing this article. Can we really be so quick to dismiss that this gentleman died? It would seem really strange for him to get that wrong. Again, if it was any other newspaper, I would agree with that. But this guy is standing here in town and seeing this person die. I don't know what's going on. This is one of those mysteries of history that maybe if we do enough digging, we can find out what is going on here. Did Mr. Levy die? We know he was sick. We know that from several sources, but did he recover and go back? Is this another Harry Levy? Is there a father and son? I don't know. The conclusions being that, again, what I started, we don't know, we can't determine where yellow fever came from in Holly Springs. I do think there's a good chance that the Memphis theory is the more correct theory of all 3 of them, but it's possible that all these individuals are contributing to what I call the body of yellow fever. That's pretty much it. Of course, this is the very beginning of yellow fever. We'll have another seminar another time to go into what happens in September, but we heard from Georgia kind of what is going on in Memphis. The exact same thing has happened in Holly Springs. Holly Springs will end up over 300 people will die of yellow fever. It could be as high as 350 based on some sources. It might not sound like a lot, it's not 5,000, but where Memphis had, 50,000 residents, Holly Springs only had 3,000. So that's still that's a much larger percentage of people dying in Holly Springs than Memphis. 5,000 is a much smaller percentage of 50,000 than 3,000 is of 300. It's 10% of our entire population wiped out. And we had a huge amount of people in town, a huge amount of families wiped out, mothers, daughters, fathers. Almost every single business was bankrupt for decades. The only good thing about yellow fever in Holly Springs, and I say this with absolute certainty, is that the town was so bankrupt in the 1880s and 1890s that we couldn't afford these massive Victorian mansions like the Fontaine House and all like that, which is a good thing. That is one of the reasons, in my opinion, other historians share this, why Holly Springs has so many surviving antebellum homes. Because most of these antebellum homes would have been replaced by Victorian homes in the 1880s, 1890s, at that era. Holly Springs was too broke to do that. So by default, our antebellum homes are still standing. Most of them are. That's just my theory, but I think if you look at the evidence, it's borne out pretty well that yellow fever is partially responsible for so many of our houses standing. But that's it for me. I'm going to turn this, well, if anyone have any questions. Yes.
So I don't want to, your filming was great. The one thing that I want to point out is the mosquitoes that you mentioned carry the disease.
Right.
Oh, and it takes 2 weeks for a mosquito
Right.
to do it. The mosquitoes don't care that there's an island. They're not restricted by that island.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So that lady who's running a restaurant, where is she going to get her food for her restaurant?
Yeah.
To the river.
Right.
And those mosquitoes are feeding on all
Exactly.
and some are not showing any signs.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Oh, that's Jim. Thank you, Jim.
So yeah, so it's not that you kind of made it seem like the sailors were the reason.
No, yeah.
It's not. It's
Well,
the
I think-
mosquitoes that are affecting
Right.
everybody.
And that's why I thought it was so interesting when Mr. Biana dies, the article basically says she didn't get it from a sailor. She got it in town from another. So we don't have any idea.
And what I think you can do that would be interesting, because it really, Americans are obsessed with this first, and we don't need the first, we need the significance and the conclusions and the consequences.
Yeah.
Look at how it travels, because we know Louisiana's at point.
Right.
So how does it travel? What city in Mississippi is hit first? Is Real? Is it
Yeah.
River? And see how it spreads out
Right.
from there.
Right.
Yeah, and it could be a combination of.
Yeah, I think it is. In my opinion, after a few years looking at this, it's a combination of Grenada, Memphis, probably the other venues of the railroad. So I don't think we're ever going to be able to narrow it down. It could be Federal Garrison too. There could have been some cases there, but I think if you look at the evidence and like you said, the 2-week period from contracting it to dying, we have to have yellow fever here in town by August 10th to 12th, 14th.
It's 2 weeks for a mosquito.
Right. Right.
And then it's 10 days for somebody to die that's got a serious case.
So that backs you all the way up to 3 weeks, basically. So we have to be in early August. There's just no other way, because by September 1st, this town is erupts with yellow fever. We have dozens of people a day. It's like it just something clicks. So what's happening is all these avenues of virus is just hitting at the right time. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. I see someone back there. Oh, yes, ma'am. You and then you.
What was the average survival rate of those who caught yellow fever?
It's actually pretty high, and this is what people don't understand about yellow fever. People think yellow fever kills everyone, and it really doesn't, because do you know, and this is a good number to have, do you know what percentage, we have a lot of people leaving town, but do you know what percentage of people who stay in town in Holly Springs contract yellow fever? Just guess. No one ever guesses. It's like 98%. Everyone who stays in town gets it. Everyone. There's very few exceptions. That's how contagious it is once it gets going. What percentage of those who contract it actually die? 10%. So it's not like it is what I would call a deadly disease. Now, once you contract it, yellow fever can go one of two ways. And if you want to, after we turn the lights on, you can see these pictures up here. Most people get a fever and all that, and then they slowly come out of it. It's a small percentage that goes into what we call, I guess, the toxic phase, and that's the phase where we get these classic symptoms. And once you get to that phase, even today, you're in trouble. It's a very high rate of death. So we're talking about 300 people dying, but we also have 2,500 in town who suffer from yellow fever at the same time and recovering. So now, as Georgia mentioned, and which is absolutely true, the vast majority of the people in town contracting yellow fever are who? Who's left once the rich and leave? The poor, but really the African Americans. So that's like, I think 85% of the people in town, we have all the numbers back there in our archives, like from that time. It's like 85% of the victims are African American. But like we said, what percentage of them are dying? Extremely low. And I want to tell this right now, because I got in trouble with this once from a really well-known historian. We don't know why that's the case. Now, there is some theories. One of the theories is that they have a built-in immunity from Africa, but talking to some other geneticists and things, that's not how this works. You don't keep your immunity we're talking centuries, not decades, but centuries from the 1600s to the 1800s. It's not seen often. So it might be possible, but that's not the prevailing theory. The prevailing theory that I've been told and that I believe in is that we're talking African Americans in 1878. They were only 10 years away from emancipation, and then we're looking at decades ago. This is awful, but it's history. When these African Americans, these enslaved people, are sold decades ago, people are buying African Americans who are what we call acclimated. And acclimated means they're acclimated to yellow fever. These are enslaved peoples who have been through yellow fever and survived. And so we get, like the seller of these enslaved people are saying, we guarantee that they'll survive yellow fever. And so if you have the people who are being sold up here in North Mississippi and their descendants probably do have some immunity built in, not from 1600, but from earlier epidemics, 1700s, 1800s, all that. That's one theory. I've even been told that theory is not right. So I don't think we'll ever be able to find out for sure, but it is a historical fact that in every single city, every single town, African Americans are hit the hardest, but suffer the least amount of deaths by a large percentage, 5 to 10%, compared to 70 to 80% of whites. So we don't know for sure, but that is true. It is a historical fact that's the case. Every single newspaper and letter mentioned that at the time, and that's why we have African Americans serving on the police department, because they're immune, or they're seemingly immune, so we have them serving as police and all that, doctors, nurses, grave diggers, and all that. Yes, ma'am, you had a question back there. I don't. Maybe have y'all heard that? Now in Holly Springs, we do know the avenues of escape, and that's Blunt Springs, Tuscumbia, and a few other places around. So we do know that, but I don't know Memphis because that's a lot of. We're talking tens of thousands of people.
Right. There was too many. We don't really know anything about a particular person.
Yeah.
Well, this is a person that lived in Savannah, and they,
Savannah to me would not be a great candidate because everyone knows that the yellow fever is spread on rivers. I mean, they don't know what's caused it, but they know it is spread on the rivers. That would not be my first place to flee to. It's on the Tennessee River. I would probably be fleeing to a town in the mountains where we think it's immune, or I'd be fleeing to what we call a spa town where it's healthy and the waters are going to save you from it. They're not going to, but that's where I would flee. But I've never heard of Savannah, Tennessee in particular. It wouldn't surprise me with as many people fleeing that there could be people there. Is there any other questions?
Are there any lists of any of the casualties from the 1878?
Yes, every single town has their own list, and they're very accurate. Our list is over there. It's been, yes.
I think the signing order made a list of.
Exactly. Yeah.
They have it at the library and all this.
Yeah, a few years ago, I and about 3 other historians in town got together. We found every single source, including local sources, the newspaper here in town, until it died off. Too many people were dying. We're listing the deaths. We used those. We used other sources. So the names back there are pretty dang accurate. Again, it doesn't have people like the Buchanans because not only did they not die here in town, but they supposedly didn't die of yellow fever. It also doesn't include Mr. Harry Levy because we only have one source that says he died here in town. We don't have any record other than that. So it might not be accurate. That's why we say there's 305 names. It could be as many as 350. So it's not for sure, but we have every known person is over there in there. Now, some of them do say unknown African American, unknown white child. We don't have names for all of them, but we do know, especially when in the September when people are dying left and right, we have to bury them really quickly. There's just not enough time to get names for some of them, especially the poor, very poor. But they are recorded as having died. So.
My second and third great grandfathers died in Memphis, supposedly from the yellow fever.
Yes, ma'am.
And I have tried to find their names on the list, and I have also been told at one time that they were buried in Edmondson Cemetery in South Haven, and I'm not correct.
That's very possible. We have a lot of people call it mass graves, or not. They're never mass graves. We don't have a single yellow fever mass grave. What we call a mass grave is bodies just being thrown in pits. Even during the height of yellow fever, we have people being buried one by one. The difference is there might not be a marker over them, or the marker could have been made of wood, which would have disintegrated. So here in Holly Springs, at the bottom of the hill, we're pretty certain, especially after we did GPR investigation, 200 bodies down there with no markers. There are not many events in this town that could have given us 200 bodies without any grave markers, except for the yellow fever. Some people say they might be Confederate, but I find that very unlikely, in my opinion, especially where they're buried. They're buried at the very, very farthest point from the city. So if you believe that yellow fever can be contracted from a dead body, it can't, by the way, generally speaking. But if you believe that, you're going to bury these bodies as far away from town as possible. And that's where this, if you go to Hillcrest Cemetery, you go all the way down the hill, all the way to the gate, the fence that separates the cemetery from the next neighborhood. We found 200 bodies down there. And without digging them up and looking, we don't know for sure, but to me, it's like 100% chance that they're yellow fever victims. But hey, Jim. Yes, sir.
If the Masons made that list for Mississippi, then they had made Memphis, Tennessee.
Right.
All the major libraries.
If your ancestors died in yellow fever and they weren't one of the unknown, like I said, they could be an unknown victim, but the majority of them are recorded. So there are ways to find it. Maybe you guys can
We
help.
have the Memphis book.
You have the what?
The Memphis book.
The Memphis book. It lists all the known. Okay. So you're welcome to send me a message if you want, and I can relay it to someone and try to get that into your hand, but it's going to be somewhere. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much. I don't know